Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I can't join you in person. I know I would have really enjoyed the discussion. So I've made my contribution a recorded video, and I've tried to make it as interesting as possible with visual slides, and I hope you enjoy it. So, of course, I welcome your feedback and wish you a great conference. Hello, I'm Peter Doshi, and my talk today is about the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna products. And I'll be presenting my argument for why and when they became what I'm calling too big to fail products. I'd like to make clear that my comments today are my own, not necessarily those of the institutions I'm affiliated with. Let's start here, a fairly recent event in the European Parliament where a Dutch member of parliament asked Pfizer whether its vaccine was tested prior to marketing to determine whether it could stop transmission of the virus. The Pfizer representative said, no. Back in the middle of 2020, before the phase 3 studies began enrolling participants, the FDA published a guidance document telling companies what it considered acceptable endpoints in an efficacy trial. The FDA offered two options. Option 1, lab confirmed symptomatic COVID. Option 2, lab confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection. Every single company went for option 1, symptomatic COVID. Not a single, not one company designed their trial to determine efficacy against infection. This is quite remarkable, but please note that this was by design. It was how the trials were designed from the start. The trials were not designed to determine efficacy against transmission or infection, nor were they designed to study serious outcomes like hospitalization, intensive care use, or deaths. In October 2020, I wrote about this for the BMJ. Moderna, as you can see, was fairly open about this. Their CMO said so on the record, that our trial will not demonstrate prevention of transmission. A month later, the CMO of Moderna said the same thing to another media outlet, warning people not to overinterpret the efficacy results. And so here he's quoted as saying, they do not show that they prevent you from potentially carrying this virus and infecting others. I was not the only person to notice this. Here's a New York Times opinion piece from August 2020 worrying about the same thing. None of the companies are testing to determine the effect against infection or transmission. The authors of this article called the approach short-sighted. And this is all back in the summer of 2020. Also back in the summer of 2020, before any results were public, people were making the point that an intramuscular injection is not likely to be able to produce the kind of immunity needed to prevent spread of disease. So this was fairly predictable from the start. Then results came in November, and the FDA asked its advisory committee whether it should grant the first ever emergency use authorization for Pfizer vaccine. During the discussion, one committee member raised the problem. Pfizer's, quote, presented no evidence, he said, quote, that the vaccine had any effect on virus carriage or shedding, which is the fundamental basis for herd immunity. Herd immunity depends on interrupting chains of transmission, and by design, these trials were set up such that we would have no evidence about how well these products could do this. The FDA realized this too. In fact, the FDA was aware of many limitations in the data. In the memo, FDA wrote in justification of granting the EUA on December 11, 2020, an entire section of the memo was devoted to describing the remaining unknowns. Was the vaccine effective against transmission of the virus? Unknown. Data are limited to assess the effect against transmission of SARS-CoV-2 who were infected despite vaccination, they wrote. How long would the protection against symptomatic COVID last? Who knows? Not possible to assess as trial participants were only followed up for a couple of months. What about the other big question? Does the vaccine save lives? FDA acknowledged. Trials just cannot say anything about that question. It's great that FDA acknowledged these important limitations in the data. Unfortunately, and this is a massive unfortunately, FDA appears to have overlooked some other important concerns. For example, in that same review memo, FDA presents summary data on serious adverse events. Here you can see Table 14, which shows 103 individuals experiencing a serious adverse event in the vaccine arm, which was 27 more individuals than in the placebo arm. On an absolute scale, the elevation in serious adverse events was greater than 1 in 1,000 people. For other vaccines, CDC says serious adverse events occur at a rate of around 1 to 2 per million people. So these data for Pfizer vaccine are presenting an increase that is about 1,000 times more common than other vaccines. FDA apparently saw no reason for concern, stating that serious adverse events were, quote, balanced between treatment groups. It's not clear to me how many people took the time to carefully read the FDA's memos. I worry the answer is very few. And anyways, within hours, attention became focused on vaccine distribution. The rollout had begun. In an article announcing the beginning of vaccine rollout, the New York Times told its readers that Pfizer's, quote, highly effective vaccine offers a new tool to slow or even stop the virus's onslaught. A message totally consistent with what Pfizer was saying, despite the lack of evidence against prevention of infection or interruption of transmission. Broad distribution was key to reaching the often quoted herd immunity goals. Not vaccines for the most vulnerable only, but vaccines for nearly all. Not tens of millions, but hundreds of millions. As soon as the vaccines were authorized, the miracle narrative emerged. The limitations took a back seat. Now, all the focus was on access. Here I'm showing you a screenshot of the homepage of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the parent organization of the FDA. I want you to note the words, safe and effective. The words safe and effective have a very specific meaning in the regulatory world. That is the language used for products that are approved, licensed, but no COVID vaccine was approved throughout the majority of the year 2021. They were all in Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA status. The EUA granted in December 2020 did not say safe and effective. It said, quote, may be effective. That is the legal language that the FDA used. The product was still under EUA through July 2021. Yet on the HHS website, that became safe and effective from day one. You can see the screenshot from December 14, 2020 when the rollout began. Safe and effective. It would seem that there's nothing that prevents HHS from marketing products as it wishes. And while Pfizer knew its trial was not designed to determine the vaccine's effect against transmission, meanwhile to regulators, Pfizer was making the case that vaccinating children would be helpful in reaching herd immunity thresholds. 60 to 70%, it said, was necessary to reduce disease transmission. Incredibly, by August 2021, it seems even FDA was somehow unable to see the disconnect between evidence and policy. This slide shows the FDA's clinical review memo evaluating whether or not to approve Pfizer's vaccine. The vaccine received EUA in December 2020, but it was only in August 2021 that FDA licensed it. Here's what's so interesting. You can see in the quote at the bottom that the FDA remains uncertain how well the vaccine prevents against transmission. Yet in a table, considering the pros and cons of approving the vaccine from the very same document, the FDA implies that one reason to approve the vaccine is to help achieve herd immunity. I believe that this ability to not see the contradiction here is a symptom of the miracle narrative. It helps explain why errors also went uncorrected. For example, this is an article that you're looking at now written by the directors of the CDC and the NIAID, Dr. Walensky and Fauci. In it, they state, clinical trials have shown that the vaccines authorized for use in the U.S. are highly effective against COVID-19 infection, severe illness, and death. But this was absolutely not true. The clinical trials did not demonstrate high prevention of infection. They did not demonstrate prevention of mortality. At the very time they wrote this letter, there was only one death that occurred across the 70,000 or so volunteers in the trial. Only one death total. And months later, when additional follow-up had occurred, there were still extremely few COVID deaths across the trial. Nowhere near enough to draw conclusions about the effect of the vaccine on mortality. You can see how low the numbers are. How could our leaders of the CDC and NIH not know this? How could the FDA not ensure that a correction was printed? As you can see, we wrote a letter to the editor. JAMA posted that letter on its website, and the editor informed me that he asked the authors to respond. He told me they did not respond to him. Or consider how Pfizer reported its results in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is the publication that came out on December 10, 2020, the day of the advisory committee meeting and one day before the EUA was granted. And here is the research summary showing the efficacy results. These are the key results the editors put before the world, captured in one table. Vaccine efficacy of 95%. Two results were shown: efficacy against symptomatic disease and efficacy against severe COVID. But the symptomatic and severe endpoint results were based on different populations and windows for counting cases. The different populations explains why there's a difference of around 3,000 people in the denominator of each group. But these different case counting windows also shows us something important. The mixture of these two variables, two different populations and two case counting windows, means that there are 4 efficacy outcomes: 2 for symptomatic COVID and 2 for severe COVID. Efficacy against symptomatic COVID could be reported as 82% if we count all cases reported from the beginning of the trial, or it could be reported as 95% if we count only those cases reported beginning approximately 1 month after the trial began, that is 7 days after dose 2. That's the analyses labeled number 1 and number 3 in arrows. Likewise, efficacy against severe COVID could be reported as 88.9% if we count all severe cases reported from the beginning of the trial, or it could be reported as 66.4% if we count only those severe cases reported beginning approximately 1 month after the trial began, again 7 days after dose 2. That's the analyses labeled number 2 and number 4 in the arrows. Well, rather than reporting results for a consistent population and case counting window, they reported the highest efficacy results among these four outputs. For symptomatic disease, choosing 95%, not 82%. And for severe disease, choosing 88.9%, not 66.4%. This mix and match approach is not consistent with good reporting practices, and we wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine to complain. The New England Journal of Medicine rejected our letter, but it did acknowledge that its reporting was inaccurate. It said the research summary was written by New England Journal of Medicine editors, not the authors, and, quote, does not represent original research reporting. They acknowledged that the entries in the table represent different populations, and so decided to eliminate the table altogether. And so just like that, in early January, the table disappeared. No erratum was placed on this article. No correction. It just silently disappeared. And despite acknowledging the problems and removal of the table in the research summary, the very same data appears in the paper abstract, and yet was never fixed. Now let's talk about waning efficacy. By the summer of 2021, reports began to emerge from Israel of waning efficacy. These reports often linked this with the notion of variants, Delta variant in particular. This article, for example, stating that the vaccine is now just 39% effective against Delta. Five days later, a Pfizer preprint was posted on medRxiv repository. Citing new data, the New York Times reported, Pfizer outlines case for booster shots. What was the reason? Pfizer's so-called new data shows vaccine efficacy wanes slightly over time. The medRxiv preprint stated, quote, from its peak post-dose 2, observed vaccine efficacy declined. This is really important to understand. For any given person, what matters is the actual efficacy of the vaccine at the time one is exposed to virus. If virus exposure only happens 4 or 6 months after vaccination, what matters is the efficacy at the 4 or 6 month time point. Peak efficacy has substantially limited utility for such a person. So what did Pfizer report in that preprint? They reported that vaccine efficacy declined over time. From an early peak of 96%, it dropped to 90% between months 2 and 4, and from month 4, further dropped to 83.7%. Here's what is interesting. Note the date of the data cutoff, March 13, 2021. This report, billed as in, quote, new data by the New York Times, was based on follow-up data through March 13. That is 4 months earlier. In fact, it was not the first time Pfizer was reporting on these data. Pfizer had already done so on April 1st in a press release that was titled, Pfizer and BioNTech confirm high efficacy and no serious safety concerns through up to 6 months. What is concerning is that this press release from April 1st makes no mention of waning efficacy. It instead just gives the high 91.3% efficacy figure. Yet what we can now see from internal documents disclosed by Canadian and European regulators is that the analysis showing waning efficacy was completed months earlier, back in April 2021. Here's another screenshot that makes this absolutely clear. All the same results that were presented in the July preprint are here in April documents. Two observations I have about this. First, it's hard to imagine how the waning efficacy in these data had anything to do with the Delta variant, because 77% of trial participants were from the United States, where Delta was not established until months after the data cutoff. Second, it shows Pfizer knew about waning efficacy from April 2021, but did not publicly disclose it for 4 months, when the New York Times reported it as new data. And at the same time in 2021 that Pfizer knew these things, we saw governments and institutions enact vaccine mandates, passports, and efforts to achieve herd immunity. Looking through these internal documents, I also learned that Pfizer had begun studies of booster vaccine far earlier than I or anybody I know had realized. In February 2021, Pfizer made a protocol amendment to begin studying boostability. Then in March 2021, another protocol amendment to study the duration of protection with a third dose. By the end of March, the first trial participants were receiving a booster dose. I thought the New York Times might be interested in reporting on this story, so I shared these same details that I'm sharing with you. I shared them with the New York Times. I thought they might be upset by the fact that they reported Pfizer's results as new data in July, but actually Pfizer had known for months. I had a meeting with the New York Times to discuss the story, but after consideration, they declined to pursue it. They said it didn't meet their high bar for stories about events more than 1 year ago. I must say, that is really one high bar, and I find it troubling that there is something akin to an expiry date for exposing important facts. Facts that, as I said, influence policies like vaccine passports, mandates, and the drive for herd immunity. The longer inaccurate and misleading statements go uncorrected in the scientific literature and news media, the longer that clinicians, scientists, and the public will be misled as to the facts regarding vaccine efficacy and safety. And I think a root cause of this problem is that the mRNA vaccines became too big to fail. This is simply my conjecture here, but my belief is that this environment where inaccuracies and misleading statements about very important things can be pointed out and still not corrected began in November, specifically on November 9, 2020, when Pfizer issued its first press release announcing interim efficacy results from its trial. More than 90% effective was the headline across the world. And at the time of this press release, there was no preprint. There was no journal publication. There were no data whatsoever. There was just a press release. About a week later, on November 20th, Pfizer sent the FDA its application for an EUA. 22 days later, after a one-day advisory committee meeting to discuss Pfizer's application, the FDA granted Pfizer an emergency use authorization. Applications to the FDA normally take 10 months to evaluate. That's in normal times. If an application is given priority review, it takes 6 months. Pfizer's application for EUA of its vaccine was evaluated in 3 weeks. And the advisory committee meeting, unlike advisory committee meetings of the past, was done online. It was a virtual meeting, and so it suffered all the normal difficulties of a virtual meeting. Hence the quote on the slide, where the FDA's top vaccine official, Marian Gruber, was speaking for a bit before somebody interrupted her to point out that her mic was muted. And by the way, Gruber later resigned from the FDA over concerns of Biden White House interference in the scientific evaluation of boosters. But I think it's worth re-listening to this meeting. This is a meeting where one advisor pointed out that there were no data on the interruption of transmission. And ultimately, 4 committee members voted against the EUA. There was a very good article written shortly after this meeting, which captures the nature of the discussion. In the interest of time, discussion and debate were curtailed. Questions went unanswered. Details were omitted. Only 1 day had been allotted for discussing Pfizer's application, and so lots of material had to be covered in a short amount of time. Enormous pressure was on the committee to vote yes. But one of the topics discussed that day was something known as an expanded access program. Expanded access is not at all the same as an EUA. Expanded access, sometimes called compassionate use, exists to provide still experimental therapies outside of a trial to patients in need. These are medical interventions for which there's still insufficient evidence to know whether benefits outweigh harms. By informing recipients desiring vaccine that the science was still insufficient to say whether benefits outweighed harms, expanded access would have made vaccine access possible while ensuring that the evidence base, such as placebo-controlled randomized trials, could continue without interruption until we had the evidence to properly judge these vaccines. Expanded access, unfortunately, is not well known and received almost no attention in the popular press. 2 groups, one that I was part of, wrote in favor of expanded access, but this had no effect. As we know, the FDA granted EUAs to Pfizer and Moderna on December 11 and 18, 2020. My argument is that the original Pfizer November press releases announcing high efficacy with no safety concerns, released with no publication and no data, made critical scrutiny difficult. This problem magnified with Moderna's press release. At this point, concerns or questions about the strength of the evidence could now be cast as dangerous academic nitpicking, slowing down access to critically needed products. The space for critical appraisal of the mRNA evidence base shrunk. By December, when FDA's advisory committee convened to judge the evidence, enormous pressure was on the advisory committee to green-light the product. 17 members voted yes, but still 4 members voted against the EUA. After FDA granted the EUA the next day, the mass vaccination effort commenced, and the space for critical scrutiny had all but closed. These events were fundamental to what set in motion the present situation of too big to fail. But I think this situation, in which inaccurate and misleading statements go uncorrected, also rests upon a long history of data secrecy and under- and misreporting of clinical trials. Here we are in 2022, and no company has shared any of their data. Moderna has not even committed to share its patient-level data. Pfizer says it will, but will only begin entertaining requests for the data 2 years after its trial finishes. But the trials haven't even finished. Billions of doses have been administered worldwide, but data sharing is held up because the trials aren't finished. I believe this is only tolerated because few people know about this and deem it sufficiently important. We wrote about this problem in an editorial in January 2022. We received no legacy media coverage. No professional society stepped forward and said something like they will refuse to endorse the products as based on science until the data are released. Data secrecy has a long legacy and it is tolerated. The other problem is under- and misreporting of trials in the literature. This is a long-standing problem. This table, put together by a team led by a career FDA reviewer, lists about 20 randomized cardiovascular trials, most of them quite large and influential in bringing various drugs to market. The table shows you the proportion of participant data that's lost to follow-up. The missing data is not good, and trialists work hard to avoid it. You want as little missing data as possible. As the most missing data, as the more that data goes missing, the more the validity of the trial is threatened. But here's what's amazing. If you look at what companies report in their peer-reviewed journal articles, they report extremely little loss to follow-up. That's the yellow highlighted column, almost always less than 1%. But then if you look at the red column, you see FDA's calculation of incomplete follow-up. It's often 10 to hundreds to thousands of times larger than what the company reported. These publications are not corrected. They continue to go on and be accepted at face value. And many trials don't even have a public record. This study of antidepressant trials showed 97% of positive trials, that is, trials where the drug beat the comparator, get published as positive trials. But when it comes to negative trials, where the drug didn't meet its efficacy endpoint, most of these trials weren't published. And of the minority that were published, the majority of that minority were not published as negative trials, but amazingly, as positive trials. My point is that we have a very long history of these practices in the literature. And rarely do we see the results of any reanalyses of trials because too few people conduct reanalyses. But when they happen, they can turn everything on its head, like this study of paroxetine for depression in children. According to the original study, the drug was well tolerated and effective. The reanalysis, however, found it ineffective and unsafe. And so when it comes to the COVID vaccines, I imagine these could be the most scrutinized trials on the planet. But for those that might assume that this amounts to a massive amount of scrutiny, well, I'm not so sure. A couple of weeks ago, I noticed that Moderna's trial, published nearly 2 years ago, was missing a copy of the original protocol. 2 days after I let them know this, they posted the original protocol. Trial protocols are critical documents. If 2 years after the fact, I was the first person to notice this and bring it to their attention, well, then I submit to you that we have a real problem. There is not a vast safety net out there scrutinizing every detail, ensuring that everything is trustworthy. Far from it. More likely is that we are seeing a continuation of a long legacy of the classic problems of under and misreporting that go uncorrected in large part because we have too few people that are aware of the scope and depth of the problem. With COVID vaccines, we have the added problem that the matters may have become too big to fail. But with stakes this high, we need all eyes on deck. Thank you so much for your attention, and again, I'm sorry I could not be there with you in person.